Welcome to Phrase by Phrase with Pastor Rick, where we study the Bible one phrase at a time. And this time we're looking at James chapter 1, verse 13, part D. We looked at where it says, let no one say when he's tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil. We looked at that. And then he goes on to say, and he himself does not tempt anyone. And that's the phrase I want us to look at today, that God does not tempt anyone. And yet we see places in the Bible where that seems to be contradicted. Probably one of the most stark is in 1 Kings chapter 22. This is the story of Ahab and Jehoshaphat. Ahab was the king of the northern tribes of Israel. Jehoshaphat was the king of the southern tribes of Judah. Ahab wanted to go to battle with Syria, and he wanted Jehoshaphat to join his forces with his so they could do battle against the Syrians. Ahab was willing to do it, but he wanted to hear what God said through the prophets. So Ahab brought together 400 of his prophets. They prophesied and said that God would give them victory. But there was something in that prophecy that made Jehoshaphat maybe not fully confident in what Ahab was saying. So he asked if there were any other prophets of the Lord, and Ahab admitted there was a guy by the name of Micaiah, but he really didn't want Micaiah to be summoned because Ahab hated Micaiah because Micaiah was a true prophet of the Lord. But he was brought in, and Micaiah predicted that they would not have victory, they would be defeated, but they went ahead and they went to war anyway. They were defeated, and Ahab was actually killed in the process. Well, Scripture records that whole incident in 1 Kings 22:19, and this is what it says. Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by him on his right and on his left. The Lord said, who will entice Ahab to go up and fall at Ramoth-Gilead? And one said this, while another said that. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, I will entice him. The Lord said to him, how? And he said, I will go out and be a deceiving spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. Then he said, you are to entice him and also prevail. Go and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a deceiving spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets, and the Lord has proclaimed disaster against you. So here, what's happening is that a deceiving spirit spoke through those 400 prophets, and the scripture here is attributing that to God, that God told this deceiving spirit to go and lie through those prophets so that the king would go ahead and go into battle. And so God is putting, in a sense, a deceiving spirit into the mouth of the prophets, and yet we have a passage like the one we're studying that says that God does not tempt anyone. And then there's other passages in the scripture that are diametrically opposed to this. For example, Titus chapter 1 verse 2 says God cannot lie, or Hebrews 6:18 that says it is impossible for God to lie. So how do you answer the discrepancy? Well, I think when you come against verses like this, you bump up against what's called progressive revelation. That as the scriptures unfold over time, the understanding of God by the people, the writers and the people, grew. So that the God that you see in Jesus in many ways looks very different than the God that you see in the Old Testament. And a lot of times that's because their understanding of God it grows over time as revelation progresses. So for example, you read the story about early on in Kings when it says that God tempted David to number the Israelites. And then David went and he numbered the Israelites, and then he was judged by God for it, and the whole nation was punished. In Chronicles, which was written 200 years later, it says something completely different. It says that Satan tempted David to number the Israelites, and he did so, and there was punishment that came. So in the first story, 200 years earlier, it's God that tempted David. In the second story, it's the devil. Well, what happened in the early days, Israel was a tribal nation under Abraham when they rose up and came along. And in the early days of Israel's history, this distinction of good and evil and God and the devil wasn't really clear, and they just attributed everything to God. But as time moved on and there was more revelation, they had a better understanding, and it was realized 200 years later that it was the devil that was tempting David to do those things. Well, in this passage, it's the same kind of an idea that Well, first of all, this is a vision. So did this actually happen? But even if this did happen, this is God allowing the Spirit to go, but they're attributing it to God. That was a Jewish idiom, that they would attribute God to doing all things. But even though God was aware of it, and even though God did not stop it, that does not mean that God was responsible for it. Look at it this way. You are a free moral agent, and you are free to go out and sin. And God knows that you're going to sin before you sin, and yet God doesn't stop you from sinning when you commit sin. So does that mean God is responsible for your sin? You could blame God for your own sin and say, it's God's fault that I committed sin. And yet that's not the case. Even though he knew about it and did not stop it from happening, you're still responsible for it, and so it is with this evil spirit as well. So again, Scripture is consistent when we understand how it's written, and this is telling us that God cannot be tempted, because remember, Jesus is both man and God, so he cannot be tempted, but it also tells us that God himself does not tempt anyone. You think about that. God bless you.